Big issue at the moment. You and I've talked about it for a few months. You put the paper out. Uh, excellent article.
Thank you.
But the thing that really stood out to me, we put the quote in there, was actually it's not just inflation, it's inflation inequality.
Yeah.
We put the quote in here: for all the talk about income inequality, we need to have a matching discussion about inflation inequality. It's something I kind of talked about with Eric Weinstein. He said, inflation is really relative. Inflation affects people in different ways. And this CPI print really is useful as a benchmark, but it's not useful to the individuals. I think it's pretty common talk amongst most people these days is that whatever print we're seeing much higher inflation ourselves. UK fuel prices hit record highs today, went up to £1.78.5 a litre, which works out at $10.15 a gallon.
It's crazy.
And the only reason it's not higher is that the pound has been falling against the dollar. I think it's lost about 10%. But it looks like we're heading to £2 a litre, which again, it's just incredible.
Yeah.
My car used to cost £80 to fill up. It's over £100 now, and it's going higher. That affects a lot of people, but it affects people in different ways, and also the second, third order effects. So, yes, a really interesting topic to get into. Like Danny said, everyone's talking about inflation now. This wasn't something I've ever talked about prior to running a Bitcoin show. Now I run a Bitcoin show, but everyone else is talking to me about it. My friends, I even talked to my kids about inflation. So it's really become part of the conversation. You guys wanted to attack this, and you wanted to attack inflation inequality. What was the background to this?
Yeah, a great question. And thanks for all the kind words about the paper. So the one thing that we discovered right away when we started FreeOp in 2016 is that if you have the lens that we have declared that we want to have, which is we exclusively work on policy problems or reform ideas that would meaningfully improve the lives of Americans whose incomes or wealth are below the US median. That's test number one. Test number two is our reform ideas should be ideas that embrace the principles of free enterprise, individual liberty, technological innovation, and pluralism. So if you look at those two tests and say, where's the intersection there? Because the whole idea is how do we get Democrats and Republicans, progressives and conservatives to work together to solve important problems? That's why we have that lens. So if you look at the landscape with that lens or with those two tests, we find that a lot of the work that really comes out of meeting those two tests is around the cost of living. Not merely inflation in the way we normally think about it, read about it in the newspaper, where the CPI print is this and the Federal Reserve does that, or other central banks around the world, but also the microeconomic conversation about inflation. So if we were to talk about inflation, we could break the inflation conversation into two categories. There's the microeconomic subcategory of inflation, which is stuff like zoning laws that restrict the growth and the supply of housing, leading to increase in price of housing. Because if you don't allow new housing to be built and the population grows and people get wealthier, then that price of houses is going to get bid up, right? That's an example of microeconomic inflation. Then there's macroeconomic inflation, which is a thing we in the Bitcoin world talk about a lot, which is the supply of money as controlled by central banks and things like that. So both categories of inflation are important, and a lot of our work outside of the macro space deals with that. So we talk a lot about healthcare inflation. We talked about that a lot in our last conversation for your podcast. There's a housing inflation. There's higher education inflation, college and vocational school and all that. All these things, the prices are skyrocketing because of dumb regulations or subsidy schemes that have created artificial scarcity or artificial demand that have made these products more expensive for everyday people. And when you're poor or when you're low income, if you're making $20,000, $30,000 a year or $10,000 a year, those prices affect you even more, right? So if the price of gas, like you were pointing out, goes up by double, and you have to drive to any sort of job you might take because you live in that part of the country, then that extra $100 a week or $200 a week you're spending, you don't have that $100 to $200. So where's that coming out of in your household budget, right? So that's something that we've noticed for years as a major concern. And I'd say about 70% of our work revolves around the cost of living. About 30% is things like criminal justice reform or education reform that aren't directly about cost of living. They're about economic growth or economic opportunity. But 70% is cost of living. So it's something we've been following for a long time. Then you throw onto that or layer onto those just baseline problems we've had as a country with what happened during COVID, where we spent $6 trillion in relief dollars through Congress, COVID relief dollars, and then the Fed came in and printed another 6 to 8 trillion in new dollars, US dollar quantity. So you put those things together, and there was this macroeconomic inflation effect on top of all the other things that we were just talking about. And so and over this time period, we've grown, we've added new scholars, and so we added two really outstanding macroeconomic scholars. One is John Hartley, who's a PhD student at Stanford, the economics department there. The other is Jackson Mejia, who is a PhD student at MIT in the economics department there. So they and I we said we wanted to track this particular problem of how. Because no one else has been doing the work. No one else has been doing the work of you see CPI, this print comes out, you read about it in the newspaper, and no one's talking about the fact that the whole point of CPI is it's the average consumer. CPI is affecting the average person in this average way. And we could have a whole episode on whether CPI accurately measures the average consumer. But even if you take it at face value and say, okay, well, let's stipulate for a moment that CPI is accurately measuring the average consumer. And again, I don't believe that it is. I don't think you do either. But let's just stipulate that for the moment, for the sake of argument. What about the below average consumer? What about the above average consumer? If you take the government's official data, how does inflation affect different populations? That was the thing that we wanted to study in this paper. And one of the things that one of the reasons why this has not been studied before, I think, is because the people who are the most dovish about monetary policy in the US and around the world are typically people on the left. The people who are hawkish are typically people on the right. That's not exactly true. It doesn't always map that way, but that's often the case. And so what's interesting is people on the left are the ones who are normally talking about inequality. And yet here you have a situation where the policy that left-leaning macroeconomists, Keynesian macroeconomists tend to want to favor, which is more monetary stimulus, it's their policy that's leading to more inequality. And so we wanted to measure this because no one else had really done it. And so Jackson and John went through and basically crunched the data using official Bureau of Labor Statistics figures on inflation, CPI, and said, okay, let's break this down in a number of different ways. So the first way to break down is actually the BLS doesn't just measure the average CPI. They actually measure indirectly non-average CPI. So what do I mean by that? So to measure the consumer price index, what the government is doing is saying, okay, we theorize that the average consumer buys X amount of groceries, Y amount of rent for housing or owning a home, Z amount of transportation costs, et cetera. So you go through the bucket of things that people normally have in their household budget.
As a percentage of their budget or as a total number?
Both, as a total number and as a percentage of their budget. So they measure that based on a survey they do. They actually literally poll people and ask them, okay, how much do you spend on X? Or sometimes they use different techniques, but they basically compile all these surveys of pricing data and of what consumers actually spend money on. And it's a very technical process that they use to come up with this. But then they come up with this average.
Just a quick question in there. Looking at the poorest in society, and then, I'm not sure how you answer this, but what kind of percentage of their income is disposable? So what I'm trying to understand, how much leeway is in their budget?
Yeah, that's a great question and a very important question. So the short answer is zero, right? Like if you are,
that's what I assume.
If you're in the bottom quintile, so the BLS typically breaks this data out into fifths. Are you in the bottom quintile of income, the second lowest, the middle, the second highest, or the highest? They measure in more detail than that, but usually in terms of the most digestible things they send out, they divide it into these 5 groups of even numbers of people based on their incomes. And what you find is that you find a couple of things. And we have the chart actually, Danny, if you want to pull it up. It's the chart, I believe, that's called Consumer Basket. Consumer expenditures by income quintile. You can pull that up on the screen. So for people who are watching the video, they could see this. And so what this chart is showing you, and I know it's hard to read the little numbers and things like that, but the yellow at the bottom is what people in each of the quintiles is spending on housing. So the bottom quintile spends 43% of their income on housing. The highest quintile, even though they have bigger houses and more expensive houses, spends only 32% of their income on housing.
The highest quintile, what kind of What's the kind of lowest income bracket that is?
I'm trying to remember what the dollar cutoff is. I want to say it's about $100,000 a year, something like that. Don't quote me on that, but it's in that range, I believe.
Oh, right. So
it might be higher than
so
that.
The highest quintile is everyone from 100,000 to billionaires.
Yeah. So they're obviously spending more on their housing, but as a share of their overall income, it's less. And the category that you see, the kind of light blue category, where it's much bigger for the highest quintile and the smallest quintile, that's personal insurance products like life insurance and things like that. Where obviously, if you're wealthy, you want to have life insurance because you got a lot of wealth to preserve, and you have the ability you have disposable income to spend on things like life insurance, which average or lower income people do not. So those are some examples in the chart of like where the consumption basket is different. And so why does that matter? It matters because if the price of housing goes up a lot compared to the price of life insurance, then lower income people, as a percentage of their consumption, not as a dollar amount, as a percentage of their consumption, it's going to go up, right? So like what I mean by that is, if the $200 to put it that way, if it goes up by, if your gas prices go up by double, right? And bottom income quintile people are spending more of their income on gas, then the percentage that inflation is, the CPI for that population is higher. And so we have a chart. I don't think it's in one of the charts I sent you, Danny, but there's a chart called the FreeOp Misery Index by income decile. If you click on that, you'll see this. So what this is showing you is the blue is the bottom decile.
The misery index.
Yeah, so the misery index is an old term from the 70s during the President Carter years, where they added the inflation rate, CPI, and the unemployment rate, and said, okay, what's the combination? And in the Carter years, it exceeded like 25%, and it's now relatively low because unemployment is relatively low. But if you look at this chart, what this chart is showing you is the light blue is the bottom decile. The dark blue, which is the next below, is the next bottom decile. And the bottom category is the orange and the light orange. Those are the wealthiest deciles or highest earning deciles. And what you see is inflation, both inflation plus employment, is much lower for those lower income groups or higher income groups, versus the lower. If you're poor, if you're in the bottom quintile, you face higher inflation, higher unemployment. And so what does that mean? So this is just on a year-on-year basis. So like, if you look at, say, 2020, the combination of unemployment plus inflation for someone in the bottom decile is like 21%. For the highest decile, it's like 4% or 5%, right? Okay. That's the difference. Now, that's in a given year. Now, imagine if you accumulate that year over year. And this is really the powerful thing. So now if you go to cumulative income growth adjusted for income-based inflation. Okay. So I apologize if you're on the podcast and you're listening to this. You can find all these charts at the FreeOp website, freeop.org. The title of the paper is Inflation's Compounding Effect on the Poor.
We'll put them in the show notes, anyone listening, and also we'll actually put them on the video as well. So if you do want to see this, you can go onto YouTube.
Great. So what this chart is showing you is the blue line or the blue curve is how cumulatively inflation affects the bottom decile versus the top decile. So that means, let's say you spent $100 of expenditures in 1978 as someone in the bottom decile, and you stayed in the bottom income decile throughout the next 40 years. How much have you basically made? Like, how much has your income grown relative to inflation? So if you've adjusted for inflation, so how much have your wages grown minus what inflation has been? Again, according to official government statistics. And according to official government statistics, from 1978 to 2021, your wages on an inflation adjusted basis grew 4% total, not 4% per year, 4% total over a 43-year period, which is effectively nothing, right? Over that same period, in the top decile, your income grew 81% total over those 43 years. And so what this chart is showing you is that
growing wealth divide.
Yeah, and that's a wealth divide, by the way. That's not just like we're talking, we've talked, inflation's a hot topic today because inflation's at 8%. Yeah. But inflation over the course of our lives has mostly been low, according to what we think of as low inflation, 2%, 3%, et cetera. That has been seen as a policy success by the Federal Reserve. That's been seen as a policy success by most mainstream economists. But what we show in this paper, and this is the real kind of aha moment for this paper, is that even periods of low inflation, compounded year over year over year over year over year, lead to massive wealth inequality. Because if you're wealthy, you've benefited in a lot of different ways from inflation. You have a stock portfolio, which grows in inflationary environments. Your home that you own grows in inflationary environments. So your assets grow. But if you're poor, you don't have assets. And so you're only surviving on the wages that you get. And those wages have not been growing. So all this to say that the message we are trying to send with this paper is over time, compounded over time, over a long period of time, even very small differences in CPI from the lowest brackets to the highest brackets grow and grow and grow and create massive income and wealth inequality. That's problem number one. And problem number two is that's true even in periods of low inflation.